All right, so we're back here again, and so we'll kind of wrap this up. We'll talk about a few little things. We'll finish out this little set of notes. So usually, when we talk about significance tests, there are usually some errors that pop up, that come up. And so one is what's called a type 1 error. And this is when we reject the null when we should have accepted. And so this is something that's called a false positive. There are also type 2 errors where null is not rejected when it should have been. And this is sometimes referred to as a false negative. And so there's a breakdown in table 0.95, but basically, one way to think about it is, let's assume that you take a test for pregnancy. And so, with this test, right, what we're basically saying is, so if we have a type 1 test equals pregnant, but you're not actually pregnant. So you took this test, it says you are pregnant, but you really aren't. That is a false positive. A type 2 is a test says not pregnant, but you are pregnant. So this is going to be like a false negative. So depending on application, one might be worse than another. And so let's think about like a different example just to illustrate. So let's say that you're dealing with an inmate who's been locked up 20 years and is facing parole, a parole board hearing. So in this kind of situation, right, an example of like a false positive would be, so parole board denies parole. Parole denies because they think you're going to offend more. So you are positive on the risk test. And you are then locked up when you could be free. Another way to think about this is the same thing, where you have an inmate faces parole board. Gets parole approved. And on parole, kills someone. So they were negative on risk, but turned out to be positive. So this is different from the pregnancy example, right? And, you might say, like depending on your perspective, right? One could be worse than the other. So it's something to keep in mind about what's actually happening with these and like the consequences of like being wrong. And so something to keep in mind, we'll make a little note here, is that the significance level is the probability of a type 1 error. So if we set alpha to 0.05, there is a 1 in 20 chance of a false positive. So this could be due to random chance alone, or some other factor, right? So just something to keep in mind. Now to expand upon something that we talked about briefly, what's a color we haven't used in a while? Oh, what do you guys think? Maybe the yellow is a little bit bright. How about this purple? So another thing to keep in mind, right, is about limitations of a significance test. Maybe a different color. So something we already talked about, right, is that this doesn't give practical significance. So even though there may be an actual difference between, from a statistical standpoint, there may not actually be any practical differences, right? So sometimes it's easy to say, oh, look, statistically there's a difference, but if it doesn't, like if the difference is small, even though the difference is non-zero, it's really issues. So the key thing to keep in mind, right, is that the test only looks for non-zero differences. It also, significance tests also do not tell you how to make a decision. So even though there may be a decision in place, that comes from you, the difference that can be. The other part is that confidence intervals tend to be more useful than a point estimate. So significance tests only say if a value is different, but a confidence interval is going to be more useful because you get a range of values to explore and examine. So it can be pretty useful. The other part is that when we think about the 1 in 20 chance of an error, or of a type 1 error, significant findings may be due to chance alone. So keep that in mind, right? So all these things are very useful and something that you should kind of digest and keep in mind. But hopefully, like this kind of is like digesting a little bit, right? But yeah, so that's kind of. I guess we'll do one more on the notes because it's kind of short too. Something to keep in mind, right, is that there's also something called power, and this refers to the risk of a type 2 error. So this is more about false negatives. So basically what we do here, right, the risk of this goes down with a large sample. And also goes down when there is a substantive difference between a null value and an alternative hypothesis value. And usually the way we try to to see how much power something has is through a power test. And power is going to be 1 minus the probability of a type 2 error. So we'll kind of explore some of these problems in the next video that hopefully will solidify some of these concepts. So I'll see you guys then.